I want to thank Blueland for sponsoring this video. Do you find paper piecing fiddly? Do your borders have waves in them? Do you struggle to transfer your designs to fabric? Freezer paper can help with these problems and a whole lot more. This quilting tutorial is all about freezer paper and why you want this valuable tool in your sewing room. So stick with me and I'll show you how to do it. Hi, I'm Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts. I give you tips, tricks, and strategies to help you make the quilt that you want to make. And if you like what you see, please hit that subscribe button. I want to take a moment to thank everyone for their support. Last week, my channel hit 400,000 subscribers. Now, you don't get a plaque from YouTube for it, but my husband made this special one for me. Before we begin, what exactly is freezer paper? It is a heavy-duty paper with a plastic coating on one side. Originally, it was designed to prevent freezer burn in meats. Not only can you write on the paper, when you apply heat to it, it forms a temporary bond with fabric. Now, this brand is by Reynolds. There is also quilting freezer paper available in 8.5 by 11 sheets. They say that it's stickier than regular freezer paper, but honestly, I don't find there's a big difference. So this is the Reynolds. This is the Quilter's freezer paper. They feel identical. However, it is letter size, and this is much easier to store than this. And this also fits in your printer, but we'll talk more about that later. Now, you should not confuse freezer paper with parchment paper, which cooks use to prevent stickiness. It is usually thinner, and it may or may not have a silicone coating to it. And you see, if I've written on it, the letters are actually fading away. You also don't want to confuse it with wax paper. Wax paper is even lighter, and it has a light paraffin wax coating on both sides. And you don't want to get that on your iron. A couple of weeks ago, I did a video on foundation paper piecing. Foundation paper piecing can give you the accuracy you desire, but it's fiddly, fussy, and messy. Using freezer paper can help eliminate that issue. I tape both the pattern and the freezer paper down to prevent shifting because our accuracy depends on it. Trace the pattern on the paper side of the freezer paper. Fold along the sew lines. Where in regular foundation paper piecing, close is good enough. In the freezer paper method, you need to be very precise when you fold. So I use this steel-edged ruler, and if I miss a line, I refold it until I get it right. Then transfer the order numbers to the freezer paper. Starting with piece number 1, press the freezer paper onto the fabric. I always put my fabric right side down and the freezer paper on top so that I don't get any of the plastic coating melting on my iron. Pull the paper back, fold on the sew line between piece number 1 and 2 and trim at 1/4 inch. Align fabric number 2 along the seam allowance. Now, instead of sewing on the sew line, we keep the paper folded and sew right next to the paper as close as possible without catching the paper. Just note that if you've nipped the paper at any time, don't worry. It's not a big deal. Just pull the paper away from the fabric. Then we flip the paper over, finger press. Then with the right sides of the fabric down, we press the freezer paper to the fabric with a hot iron. And repeat. Find the next sew line and fold the paper back. Trim at 1/4 inch. Align fabric 3. Sew along the fold. Finger press. Flip and press with a hot iron. Continue these steps until the block is finished. This is a fairly simple block. Even with this pattern, you can see that if you have not traced the lines accurately, or your folding is off, or your seams are too far from the paper, your points may not line up. Trim blocks with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then carefully remove the paper. Ta-da! Easy peasy, right? This method is so quick and easy, you might wonder why we don't use it all the time. Well, it does come with some disadvantages too. It's great on big blocks or one with a decent size piece number 1. On smaller blocks or ones where they start with a small piece at the beginning, it's often not enough of a bond to keep the freezer paper secure. It can fall off, and you've got to be careful when you reapply it to align all the seam allowances with the folds. And that can be a bit tricky. Now, another advantage to freezer paper is that you can use it over and over again. I think my personal record is 14 times. If you only need 1 or maybe 2 copies of the same block, like in this whole block quilt by Violet Craft, tracing it all out might be more effort than it's worth. And with regular foundation paper piecing, if you trim off that seam allowance, you can leave your papers in as you assemble the quilt top, giving it stability. But with freezer paper, you are removing the papers after every block. So be sure that the fabric grain on those outer pieces of fabric are square to the edge of your block to help prevent stretching. Now, for more tips on foundation paper piecing, including how to make your fabric flip properly, I'm going to refer you to this video here, and I'll leave a link to it in the video notes below. Now, if you don't have a light table or you're using an opaque fabric like cork or felt, you can just draw or copy your motif onto some freezer paper. Then, with the plastic side down and a hot iron, press the freezer paper onto your fabric. Now, this is not just a light flick of the iron. It needs to sit for 5 to 10 seconds to get set. Then, cut out your motif, remove the paper, and use as desired. Sometimes tracing designs takes too long, or you don't care for your drawing skills anymore. If you have the design on your computer, you can use your printer. Now, this is really important. First, you need to bond your freezer paper to a regular piece of printer paper. I'm using a letter size, but you can be using a legal size or an A4. Then cut your freezer paper 1/4 of an inch smaller than your printer paper. Then with a hot iron, press the paper onto the plastic side of the freezer paper. It's really important that the freezer paper is completely covered and no pieces are overlapping the edge of the printer paper. Then load it into your printer. Look for the symbol that shows the top and the right side of the paper and load the printer with the freezer paper on the right side. From your print window, be sure that the scale is set to 100%. Then print as normal. Then pull your freezer paper away from the printer paper and you're ready to go. You can also print foundation paper piecing patterns and save yourself the trouble of all that tracing. I tried it on both printer paper and newsprint, and the trick for it to work well is you need to let the paper cool. It will begin to separate if you take it off too hot. Spring is finally here, and that means spring cleaning. I am so glad that I have found Blueland products. It has simplified my cleaning, and I no longer need to purchase those big, bulky bottles. All I need is these bobbin-sized tablets to keep my space clean. And this is how it works. You fill your Forever bottle with warm to hot water just to the watermark. Drop one of these bobbin-sized tablets into the bottle. There's definitely something cool about watching the tablet dissolve. And then it's ready to use in minutes with no shaking or stirring. Refills start at just $2.25 a tablet, which is less than a cup of coffee. And it's the same process for their glass cleaner, their bathroom cleaner, their all-purpose cleaner, and our family favorite, the hand soap. To celebrate Earth Month and Blueland's 5th birthday, Blueland has brought back all the fan favorite scents into one best-smelling collection. Click on the link below or this QR code, then go to Bestsellers to order your first kit. Blueland is also celebrating Earth Day and their 5th anniversary with up to 30% off. So often we are dealing with fabrics on the bias that can stretch while we sew and put things out of square. For example, these diamond fabrics all have two biased edges, and it's really easy for these to distort when sewing Y seams. Take a piece of freezer paper and cut to the finished size of the block and fuse it to the fabric. It no longer stretches, and when the block is sewn, you remove the paper and use it on the next block. Where I like to use it is in stretchy seams in borders. A couple of months ago, I made another STASHBUSTER 8 made with one jelly roll. The outer edges of this block are on the bias and it's super stretchy. So I cut some 2-inch strips of freezer paper and fused them to the edge of my big block. It doesn't matter if you need 2 pieces. See how nice and stable it is now? So once you have the paper on, you trim at 1/4 inch. Then you attach your next border. I'm using a 2-inch strip. And I'm using clips and keeping the freezer paper on the top. Now sew 1/4 inch from the edge of the paper. Then press with a hot iron. And now you can remove the paper. It's really nice how nice and flat this border lies. Now, if you want to make your own version of STASHBUSTER number 8, I'll leave a link to that video in the notes below as well. When you get to the end of the quilt, if you're like me, the last thing you want to do is fuss with a quilt label. So when I discovered that I can print one on fabric in my printer, I really liked that shortcut. And it's pretty darn simple. First, you need to treat your fabric with this solution. Just follow the direction and it will help the inks last longer. When the fabric is dry, cut an 8 3/4 inch by 11 1/4 inch piece. Fuse to freezer paper that's cut the same size. Then trim all the edges so there's no overlap of fabric or freezer paper. Then make your design on your computer, load paper with the fabric side on the good side, then press print. When the printing is complete, peel away the freezer paper and your labels are ready to go. I am in the middle of going back and labeling all my older quilts, as I have learned that the maker and the making is an important part of every quilt story. It doesn't matter if you're a beginner, your efforts are valuable. So check out this video here and see all the different ways you can make one. Stencils are not as important to quilters as they are for other crafters. Besides the obvious of using stencils to stamp your fabric with paint, I have found several other areas where freezer paper stencils can be useful. When you use the potholder method in Quilt As You Go, you need to keep your quilting away from the edge so that the fabric can be turned under. So if you make a frame from freezer paper and fuse it around the edges of the block, you can easily see where to stop while quilting. When you are making a label or having fun with fabric markers, you can use the stencils to give a nice clean edge to your motif. When you are making a memory quilt of handprints or signatures, sometimes the artist may go a little askew. By making a frame out of stencil paper around a block can direct people to the part of the block that you want covered and not worry about anybody writing over the edges. I am including applique and English paper piecing in this video because freezer paper has been traditionally used for those applications. But nowadays we have access to other products that can often do the job better. For applique, we cut the freezer paper in the finished size of the motif. Then using the freezer paper as a guide, cut your fabric using a generous allowance. I'm using at least 1/4 inch here. Then fuse it to the fabric. Then turn the seam allowance over the edge of the paper and finger press. And when you've gone around the whole motif, press again with a hot iron. You can trim your seam allowance to 1/8 inch if you prefer. What we are looking for is a sharp crease in the fabric that we can use in our turned edge applique. Then sew around the motif with an invisible whip stitch. For English paper piecing, I normally prefer a heavier weight of paper. But with that method, you need to either baste it with glue or with hand stitches. When you use freezer paper, the need to baste is optional as the paper is fixed in place, showing the edge. And you can fuse your paper to the fabric first and then trim it. Press the fabric over to give you a sharp crease. Then use it as you would any hexagon. And when all sides are safely sewn in your quilt, you can remove the paper and use it again. And there you have it. Freesia paper is not just for your kitchen anymore. It is your new best friend in your sewing room. I hope that you can incorporate this magical tool in your quilting adventures. And speaking of quilting adventures, join me and Versat Travel in September for our textile tour of the Netherlands and Belgium. We are staying in the beautiful old town of Zutphen, and we have our own private coach as we tour around. There will be open air markets and quilt stores, lace, linen, African wax prints, museums, and a couple of local celebrities will be joining us on the bus. I hope that you can join us too. Go to my website and just follow the directions on the homepage. This video is part of a series on paper piecing. I will link the full playlist here. And if you feel like making your own Stash Buster number 8, I'll link that playlist here too. Take care, and I'll see you next time.